Oftentimes in mystical experiences and religious experiences, we hear about these drastic states that people have. In Christianity, you have cases of people saying they've encountered Christ, that they've seen God and God has come down to them. In Buddhism, you hear these cases of no self. I meditated for this amount of time, and now I no longer, and I've had a brief instance where I had this experience where I could see the truths in the doctrines where there's no self and that things don't have essence. And you also have cases of, as in Richard Buck's Cosmic Consciousness book, where there is what Richard Buck himself said to be a state of cosmic consciousness, an ineffable state where someone experiences something that's just so profound in perception that it changes their interpretation of the world and themselves completely. And we even have authors like William James, this kind of one of the starting founders of this perennialist movement, where you have this notion of people encountering the divine and it being an ineffable kind of state where someone's just for the first time kind of aligning themselves with this notion of the divine. And so we have a lot of these cases, but it's always a curiosity of mine that what really is happening. It can't be that it is singularly one of these things, because then we have the contradiction from other sources, right? The Buddhist non-self is different to the Christian meeting the God, but yet they're both experiencing something of the sorts. And while some people, almost like maybe some constructivists, would say that these two are ultimately two different experiences, I want to kind of be interpreting from a sort of perennialist view where these experiences are the same, yet because of something of attributing culture to experiences, as in outlined by this article Experience by Robert Sharf, that people apply their cultures and their religious background onto these experiences that they're having. So Richard Buck, who had no cultural experience to explain such a phenomenon, could not really explain it at all. He said it was ineffable, and he tried to make sense of it through corroborating various sources. But if you're a Buddhist and you meditate and you have one of these experiences, you have a framework that is already built to kind of explain these phenomenons. So the Buddhist framework would be what you experienced was non-self. What you experienced was a sort of awakening. What you experienced was a sort of Zen Satori. And they would say that, and then the Christians would say the other way around. But a lot of times, the things we use to make sense of the world around us may not necessarily be the truth in itself. A lot of times they can just be used to guide us towards better understanding. For example, oftentimes in Chinese medicine or often Chinese philosophical thought, a lot of it does not stand in terms of scientific backing or Western science. But yet, it seems to help the people, the Chinese people who practice the Chinese medicine in some way. So, that's just an example, but even other things where you're just kind of attributing ideas to things that may not be true are really only used because even if they may not be the entire metaphysical truth, they help them to align themselves. So in some sense, religion is kind of like this. Religion is giving a theory that people can use to understand what they're experiencing. Even if the religion itself may not be metaphysically true, it can still help them act in a better way. And in that sense, people can have these experiences, and they use the culture to interpret it. But the question I'm trying to ask here is, what even are these experiences? What are people experiencing when they go into these sort of mystical trance-like states? And I think this kind of really stems from this idea that people are not seeing a different, out of their sort of mystical state. They're not seeing something that is not unique or that is not original to the human consciousness. Rather, they're experiencing something more so of how we're supposed to perceive, how we're supposed to be conscious. And the reason I'm saying this is because that I believe that most people will see the world through a sort of illusory perspective. So bottom up, right, phenomenologically, they're seeing the world through illusion. And I think it has to do specifically with from the illusion of the self. and that perpetrating outwards into seeing a sort of essence in everything. And this is, again, bottom up, so the way everything's perceived is just perceived as with inherent essence. And this in itself is an illusion. However, since we have only seen that through our entire lives, we don't know it's illusion. And we think then that is the norm and that is how the world should operate. But then this kind of thought mindset becomes quickly very false to think about. To say that our mindset, our consciousness, is the one that should be is completely wrong, right? Radical empiricism will say that there is no one correct perspective in the world to say objective truth of the world. Otherwise, would bats be seeing the world more correct than us, seeing the world in UV radiation, or would a blind animal who uses echolocation to view the world see the world in a more accurate way than us humans will? And then can we assume that all life even perceives world in the sort of same sensory way humans do? The point is, we don't know, we can't say. And therefore, thinking that the human perception is the egocentric sort of perception of the universe is then kind of flawed. So in some sense, I'm bringing this up to say that the people who kind of see the world in an illusory way, who think that is the real world and how it's supposed to be, will then attribute any sort of thing that is not that to a sort of out of this world experience or something bigger than humans. In reality, it's just a kind of a phenomenological shift. And I think this shift will happen when a bit of this illusion is kind of put down for a second. So the illusion of the self will happen because we all see a sort of essence in who we are. The person we think we are that is going to die. Since we see essence in that makes us see the world in a very different way. If that is kind of interfered with a little bit of time, interfered in some sense, we are able to see out of that. So the way I kind of imagine is someone who's seeing the world through illusion is, constantly, it's like they're on a roller coaster, and they're constantly engaged with the world in almost blindfolded way, as if they have their eyes covered. And in one of these sort of experiences, what really happens is that it's for the first time they're out of the roller coaster, they take a step back, and this is all bottom up. They'll take a step back and they realize, oh, what is happening? And again, this is, not again, but in this state, really no words can really be said about it. And all of these experiences we see across Christianity, Buddhism, and even cosmic consciousness, we see that they all have this similar notion of being ineffable. Human language cannot even begin to explain what this sort of experience is. And because that is because the human experience belongs in the illusory realm, and to even start to explain the sort of the phenomenological experience of seeing the world through this first-time awareness, unscathed by illusion, is just completely impossible task to do. But yet that is what they're experiencing. And it comes from a brief momentary cessation of the illusion of the self, or that is what I so far believe right now. As it comes from some of my frameworks that I've developed in sort of my course and other frameworks. But that's what's happening there. And I mean, that's kind of, I think that's interesting to think about in itself. But what does that imply then? I think that implies this sort of, it's almost a perennialist take to this whole religious idea, that these experiences are all one of the same. They're one and the same thing, and it's like the color red. Say this color red behind me. I can see this color red, but the way I perceive the color red may not be the same way to you perceive the color red. There's no way to definitively say that I see the same color that you do in a sort of sensory way. Just like a blind man or somebody who sees colors in a different way, or a colorblind man will see the red as a different way than you do. But yet this is the same sensory input coming to both of us. So the same sensory input can be coming to me and a colorblind person, and we can both use the word red or the idea of color to attribute to this thing, but the way we're perceiving it is so different. And so this can be a similar sense of sort of this experience of mysticality or something. And what I'm arguing is that the input is the same. The input happens as a result of the cessation of the illusion of self for a brief moment. And the output is interpreted vastly differently depending on the cultural interpretation you're putting onto it, whether it be Christ or whether it be Buddhism or whatnot. So that's a sort of a perennialist argument. But then I'm not saying that religion will come from that. Religion does not come as a part of somebody who's seen one of these experiences. I think it's a little more nuanced, but I'm not going to go too much into this in this video. But I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. However, then what are the implications of these ideas? I think that while we can use cultural representations to explain these ideas, I think it is better to ultimately understand, if we want to get anywhere closer to really dabbling at the human suffering and the meaning of life, to understand a more cohesive wide embracing sort of idea to explain these phenomena. So yes, we have Christian experiences, yes, we have Buddhist experiences, but humans are so similar. There's no way, depending on the religion, we can have vastly different experiences, right? Like there's only one color red of input. There's not a different one. We can't have so many of them. So then it's kind of difficult to say that we could have potentially various sorts of experiences. So then, the reason I'm trying to bring this up is then we're trying to find common ground. What is the common ground between these religions? And that's important because ultimately I feel like a lot of religions are trying to get at the same thing. And so if the experience of what they're experiencing within the religions comes from this similar ground of the illusory self and a short cessation of it, then that is profound in terms of understanding religion and understanding suffering. And if this framework is right, I have a whole course on it. There's a bunch of information across my profile about it. But if that is right, then I can't imagine the impacts this will have, but it's interesting nonetheless. I don't know if I spoke too much about this stuff, but yeah.